March 23, 1945. Night was settling over western Germany, and the Rhine River flowed dark and confident beneath the fading light. On the eastern bank near Wesel, Oberst Wilhelm Steinberg steadied his binoculars and stared across the water. His hands trembled just slightly, not from fear, but from certainty. For 2,000 years, this river had guarded Germany. Romans had respected it. Napoleon had failed to force it under fire. Now the Americans stood on the opposite bank, massed and restless, but Steinberg wrote calmly in his notebook that night. They had reached the sacred river, yes, but they could not cross. No army ever had, not against determined German resistance, not without bridges, not without time. Across the water, artillery flashes began to pulse like distant lightning. Thousands of Allied guns opened fire, illuminating the western bank in violent bursts. To German observers, this was reassuring. This was familiar. This was how river crossings worked. First the bombardment. Then infantry boats. Then engineers struggling to throw bridges across the current while defenders destroyed them piece by piece. The Rhine was wide, over 1,000 feet in places. Its current was fast, unforgiving. German engineers had promised their commanders that no force could cross it quickly. The math said so. Doctrine said so. History said so. What Steinberg could not see in the darkness were the vehicles waiting quietly among the trees and ruined farm roads behind the Allied lines. They did not look like weapons of destiny. They looked awkward, ugly even. Boat-shaped trucks with wheels, their hulls dull olive drab, engines idling low. The Germans had seen them before in Normandy and Italy, had noted them in reports and dismissed them. Curiosities. Beach toys. American excess, like ice cream barges and Coca-Cola bottling units. They were not considered relevant to serious river warfare. That assumption was about to collapse. At roughly the same hour Steinberg was writing in his notebook, 2,000 men of the 51st Highland Division's Black Watch were climbing aboard those strange vehicles. Not into fragile assault boats. Not into pontoons waiting for engineers. They stepped into DUKWs, amphibious trucks operated by American crews. Each one carried a full rifle squad and its equipment. These vehicles would not shuttle back and forth under fire. They would drive into the Rhine once, cross it, climb out wherever they reached the far bank, and keep going. This moment was the culmination of a failure that had begun months earlier in German intelligence offices. After the war, General Gunther Blumentritt would admit that the Wehrmacht fundamentally misunderstood American amphibious capability. Reports from Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and Normandy had all mentioned Schwimmwagen auf Lastwagenbasis, swimming trucks. But analysts filed them away as novelties. German thinking was shaped by German limits. Because Germany could only build a handful of amphibious vehicles, they assumed the Americans faced the same constraints. Major Hans-Georg Model, son of Field Marshal Walter Model, recorded similar confidence in his diary. German officers believed they understood river crossings better than anyone. They had studied the Dnieper, the Seine, the Volga. River assault was governed by immutable laws: artillery preparation, infantry boats, bridgeheads, bridges, armor last. Every phase gave defenders time to react. Every phase could be disrupted. That belief shaped everything. Captured intelligence files tell the story starkly. In 6 months of reports, the DUKW was mentioned only 3 times. Each mention dismissed it as irrelevant to rivers. Estimates suggested the Allies had perhaps 100 of them in all of Europe. The reality was staggering. By March 1945, more than 2,000 DUKWs were operating in theater, organized into specialized amphibious truck companies, trained, practiced, refined. British forces had received thousands more through Lend-Lease. Canadians operated hundreds, modified for cold weather. This was not improvisation. It was doctrine, and German intelligence never saw it. The origin of the DUKW was almost absurdly mundane. In 1942, a Coast Guard boat ran aground near Provincetown, Massachusetts. Trucks couldn't reach it through sand and surf. That small problem triggered a big idea. Palmer Putnam, working with the Office of Scientific Research and Development, teamed with yacht designers and engineers to imagine a truck that could swim. Ford said it couldn't be done fast enough. General Motors said it could. 38 days later, the prototype rolled out of a GMC plant in Michigan. It was built from standard truck components wrapped in a watertight hull. It had a propeller, a rudder linked to the steering wheel, and a revolutionary system that allowed drivers to inflate or deflate tires while moving. It wasn't elegant. It didn't need to be. It worked. By the time of the Rhine crossing, over 21,000 DUKWs had been built. They shared parts with hundreds of thousands of standard trucks. Any mechanic could fix them. Any soldier could learn to drive one in hours. This was not craftsmanship. This was industrial warfare. On the German side, defenses looked formidable. The First Parachute Army, though battered, still existed on paper. Bunkers lined the river. Artillery had every crossing point registered. Bridges had been destroyed. Orders assumed the enemy would need 2 or 3 days just to establish bridgeheads. Counterattacks were planned accordingly. What German doctrine could not account for was a crossing without bridgeheads. At 9 p.m., under cover of the artillery barrage, the first DUKWs entered the Rhine. Black Watch soldiers felt the moment the wheels left the bank and the vehicle began to float. The American drivers didn't hesitate. They just kept driving. Water rushed past the hulls. Shells splashed nearby. The current was stronger than expected, pushing vehicles downstream, but that hardly mattered. Wherever they reached the far bank, they climbed out and drove inland. By 10 p.m., the first wave was already gone, driven straight into German rear areas. Defenders waiting for the sound of assault boats returning heard nothing but artillery. German positions were being engaged from directions that made no sense. At dawn, confusion turned into disbelief. Reports flooded headquarters. Enemy troops were appearing miles inland, already dug in, already supplied. No bridges had been built. No pontoon parks detected. An 88mm battery commander radioed that enemy forces were behind him and demanded to know how they had crossed. They hadn't crossed the Rhine the way Germany expected. They had ignored it. By morning, hundreds of DUKWs were moving across the river in continuous streams. Not at 6 planned crossing sites, but everywhere. Anywhere the bank allowed. German artillery could not cover a 20-mile front against targets that appeared and vanished at will. As the fog lifted, the second hammer fell from the sky. Operation Varsity began. Thousands of aircraft filled the air. Paratroopers descended almost within sight of the river. This wasn't a deep raid. This was integration. Airborne troops landed close enough to be supplied by vehicles that had driven through the Rhine itself. Ammunition arrived by truckboat. Wounded were evacuated the same way. By noon, 3 Allied divisions were across with full equipment. Supplies flowed not over bridges, but through water. Hot food arrived at the front still steaming. Coffee was served miles inside Germany hours after the crossing began. German soldiers wrote in their diaries that the enemy seemed to have unlimited vehicles that could swim. Blowing bridges no longer mattered. By March 25, German counterattacks collapsed before they could begin. There was no bridgehead to smash. No center to strike. Just Allied units everywhere, continuously reinforced. One German panzer brigade attacked toward the river and found nothing to attack. Swimming vehicles were reinforcing every sector simultaneously. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who had believed the Rhine would stop the war watched trucks drive out of it like it was a puddle. Prisoners asked how the American Navy had reached central Germany. When told the vehicles simply swam, many stopped resisting altogether. Within 72 hours, the Rhine, Germany's last natural barrier, ceased to exist as a defensive concept. Over 15,000 troops crossed by DUKW. Thousands of tons of supplies followed. Vehicles, artillery, wounded, all moved without bridges. What should have taken weeks took days. Churchill crossed the Rhine himself, cigar clenched in his teeth, defying security and artillery alike. Eisenhower watched the trucks stream back and forth and remarked that every river in Germany had become a highway. And that was the truth the German command finally understood. This was not a tactical trick. It was an industrial revolution. Germany had built perhaps 100 amphibious vehicles, exquisite and rare. America had built tens of thousands that were merely good enough, and that was enough to end a war. By the end of March, Allied armor was racing east. Supply kept pace. Rivers ahead were crossed the same way. German morale collapsed. Units surrendered in masses. Civilians watched wet trucks roll through their towns and knew the war was over. Afterward, German generals admitted the failure was not courage or preparation, but imagination. They could not conceive of an enemy who would solve a battlefield problem by building thousands of machines to erase it. The DUKWs that crossed the Rhine did more than carry soldiers. They carried a new reality. That in modern war, industry could make geography irrelevant. That mass production could defeat doctrine. That a river guarded for 2 millennia could be turned into a road in 3 days. And when the last DUKW crossed the Rhine in May 1945, carrying food instead of rifles, the transformation was complete. The same vehicle that broke Germany's final defense now delivered aid to its civilians. The Rhine had not been conquered. It had been made obsolete.